When you've led one of the world's biggest rock bands for more than 60 years, it's impossible not to clash with other musicians. Rivalries form, comments get taken out of context, and suddenly a passing remark turns into a headline about hate. With Mick Jagger, that edge has always been part of his personality. He can be brutally honest one moment, then surprisingly generous the next. So when people talk about 6 musicians he supposedly hated the most, it's not just a list of enemies. It's a window into his taste, his competitiveness, and the way rock's biggest frontman never held back his opinions. And the first clash begins with Led Zeppelin. Few rivalries in rock history were as intense as the one between the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. Both bands were chasing the same crown, taking the blues, pushing it louder, and dominating the biggest stages in the world. But beneath the surface, things were far from friendly. When Led Zeppelin released their debut album in 1969, Mick Jagger, along with George Harrison, made it clear they hated it. This wasn't just casual criticism. It was a direct reaction from 2 of rock's biggest names who instantly bristled at Zeppelin's thunderous new sound. For Jagger, this was more than music, it was competition. Zeppelin were suddenly storming the gates, threatening to change the entire landscape of rock. And it wasn't hard to see why. Zeppelin represented a new kind of rock, heavy, unapologetic, and aggressive. They took the same blues roots that had inspired the Stones but amplified them to a level that felt almost overwhelming. Jagger's Stones were built on rhythm and feel, a pulse that made people want to dance. Zeppelin's style was something else. Chest-pounding riffs, screaming vocals and long dramatic solos that felt designed more for spectacle than for the dance floor. To Jagger, it was cold and excessive, and he didn't hide his dislike. The rivalry wasn't just musical, it was cultural. By the end of the 1960s, the Rolling Stones had already cemented themselves as the world's greatest rock and roll band. They had outlasted the Beatles, survived scandals, and were still filling stadiums. Then came Zeppelin, younger, hungrier, and pulling in a new generation of fans who wanted louder, heavier, and wilder. Suddenly, the Stones weren't the only kings of British rock. What made things even sharper was the business side of the industry. The Stones had always ruled live performances, but Zeppelin quickly developed a reputation as one of the greatest live bands of their era. Their shows were massive, chaotic, and groundbreaking, and their success only fueled Jagger's disdain. To him, Zeppelin weren't just another band, they were a threat to the empire he had built brick by brick. In those early years, the rivalry was undeniable. The Rolling Stones were defending their throne, and Led Zeppelin were the challengers charging forward with everything they had. And for Mick Jagger, Zeppelin's arrival was not just background noise. It was a direct challenge, one that tested his place at the very top of rock and roll. By the 1990s, a new wave of British rock had taken over, and at the center of it all stood Oasis. The Gallagher brothers, Liam and Noel, had built their entire reputation on arrogance, attitude, and anthems that echoed the Beatles. They became the face of Britpop, a movement that defined the decade. But when Mick Jagger was asked about them, he didn't hold back. He said he couldn't dance to their music, and for him, that was the ultimate deal breaker. That comment might sound simple, but from Jagger, it was devastating. He had always judged music by one rule: does it move the body? The Rolling Stones built their empire on rhythm, swagger, and that raw groove that kept stadiums swaying from start to finish. Their songs weren't just listened to, they were felt, every riff and drumbeat pulling audiences into motion. Oasis, however, were different. Their songs were made for sing-alongs, for raised fists and echoing choruses, not for hips and rhythm. To Mick, that made their music stiff, flat, and lifeless. And he wasn't subtle about it. While the 90s press often crowned Oasis as heirs to the Beatles, Jagger wasn't impressed by the hype. He believed music had to connect physically, not just emotionally, and Oasis simply didn't measure up. Fans could chant Wonderwall and Don't Look Back in anger all they wanted, but if a song couldn't make Mick Jagger move, it wasn't worth his time. That was his line in the sand, and Oasis crossed it. This wasn't a passing comment. It was Jagger dismissing an entire movement. Britpop might have ruled the charts, but to him, it lacked the essential ingredient that defined rock and roll: rhythm. And coming from a man who had spent his career turning stages into dance floors, that was more than criticism. It was rejection. So while Oasis thrived on their swagger and constant feuds with other bands, Mick Jagger made it clear he wasn't a fan. He didn't need the Gallagher brothers' brand of rock, and he didn't respect their style. To him, Oasis were loud, overhyped, and missing the heartbeat of real rock and roll. In Jagger's eyes, they failed the most important test of all. And that same sharp sense of competition followed him across the Atlantic, where another band was constantly accused of being nothing more than a mirror image of the Stones. If there was ever a band that Mick Jagger was constantly compared to, it was Aerosmith. From Steven Tyler's stage presence to Joe Perry's guitar work, critics quickly branded them the American version of Jagger's style. For rock fans, that label felt exciting, but for Jagger himself, it was far from a compliment. He hated the idea of another band being packaged as his reflection, especially when their frontman seemed to borrow so heavily from his moves and persona. All through the 1970s, the comparisons were everywhere. Music magazines loved placing Steven Tyler and Mick Jagger side by side, pointing out their similar lips, fashion choices, and flamboyant strut. Steven Tyler later admitted how much the comparisons bothered him, because no matter how successful Aerosmith became with hits like Dream On and Sweet Emotion, the shadow of Mick Jagger loomed over every review. But if it was frustrating for Tyler, it was even more insulting to Jagger. Mick had always taken pride in being a true original, someone who created a blueprint that others could only follow. So when he saw Aerosmith rising to fame on a style that looked almost identical to his, it irritated him deeply. He never embraced them, he never praised them in interviews, and he never showed the warmth that he occasionally extended to other artists. Instead, he kept them at a cold distance, letting his silence send the message clearly: he did not respect Aerosmith the way the press tried to make it seem. And while Steven Tyler openly admitted Jagger had inspired him, that respect was never returned. Jagger didn't like the constant comparisons, and he certainly didn't enjoy being told that someone else was doing his act in America. He viewed Aerosmith as imitators, a band living in the space he had already defined, and that was enough to put them firmly on his list of musicians he disliked. For Jagger, Aerosmith were not rivals worth acknowledging. They were proof that his influence was so powerful, others were forced to copy it. And instead of flattering him, that only made him hate the comparison even more. But while Jagger kept Aerosmith at a cold distance, the next band on his list became something else entirely, the target of one of his sharpest jokes. That band was Bon Jovi. If there was one band that Mick Jagger never took seriously, it was Bon Jovi. By the mid-1980s, they were filling arenas with glossy, radio-friendly hits like Livin' on a Prayer and You Give Love a Bad Name. To millions of fans, they were rock heroes. But to Jagger, they represented everything he disliked about modern rock: polished, packaged, and lacking the grit that defined real musicianship. He saw them as more of a pop act dressed in leather than a genuine rock band. One of the most famous stories that reveals Jagger's attitude toward Bon Jovi comes from his own playful but cutting humor. John Bon Jovi has often recalled working at a recording studio as a teenager, where Jagger and David Bowie walked in. Later, when Jagger introduced Bon Jovi on stage, he jokingly called them the Frogs, poking fun at John's early days in the studio. On the surface, it might sound like harmless banter, but fans understood it differently. For Jagger, it was his way of mocking a band he didn't respect, turning them into the punchline of a joke. But the tension didn't end with a nickname. Jagger never praised Bon Jovi publicly, and in interviews, he often dismissed the kind of arena rock that Bon Jovi embodied. He believed rock music needed rawness, danger, and a sense of rebellion. Bon Jovi songs, with their polished production and mass appeal, felt more like a product than art. To Jagger, they weren't pushing boundaries, they were following formulas. And the contrast in image only made things worse. Jagger had spent decades building his reputation as a frontman who lived on the edge, unpredictable and unapologetic. Bon Jovi, on the other hand, embraced a clean, glossy look that made them safe for MTV and teenage fans. For Jagger, that kind of rock was hollow. It was designed for the charts, not for the soul. The result was clear. Jagger didn't just dislike Bon Jovi, he dismissed them entirely. He never gave them the respect that many other artists received, and instead left them with the sting of his jokes and his silence. For him, Bon Jovi symbolized the kind of safe rock he had always hated. And while Bon Jovi became the butt of Jagger's humor, the next name on his list came from a completely different direction. A band whose music he openly criticized, even while the rest of the world adored them. That band was Coldplay. By the early 2000s, Coldplay had become one of the biggest bands on the planet. Their soaring ballads, emotional lyrics, and carefully polished sound won them Grammy Awards, sold-out tours, and millions of devoted fans. But while the world was falling in love with Chris Martin's gentle voice and Coldplay's stadium anthems, Mick Jagger was not impressed. In fact, he openly criticized them, making it clear that their music simply wasn't for him. Jagger was once quoted saying he found Coldplay's songs safe and coffee table music, implying that they were pleasant enough to play in the background but lacked the edge that true rock and roll demanded. For a man who had built his career on rawness, rebellion, and electrifying rhythm, Coldplay's carefully polished style felt lifeless. He didn't hear danger in their music, he heard comfort, and to Jagger, comfort was the enemy of rock. It wasn't just about sound, it was about energy. Jagger had always valued music that made people move, that could turn a concert into an explosion of rhythm and chaos. Coldplay, with songs like Fix You and Yellow, created a different kind of atmosphere, emotional, mellow, and slow building. Millions of fans swayed to their music, but Jagger dismissed it as too soft, too predictable, and far too safe to be called rock. And unlike some of the other bands he disliked, he didn't hide his feelings. His dismissive remarks about Coldplay quickly spread through the press, sparking debates between generations of music fans. Some argued that Coldplay were redefining modern rock, while others agreed with Jagger that they lacked grit, soul, and authenticity. What was clear is that Jagger's words carried weight, and when he spoke, people listened. Even as Coldplay's fame grew, Jagger never offered them the kind of praise he gave to other artists. He never embraced them as equals, and he never softened his criticism. For him, Coldplay represented the very opposite of what he believed rock music should be. They might have filled stadiums, but in Jagger's eyes, they would never capture the raw spirit that defined the genre. And while Coldplay ruled the charts with their emotional ballads, the next band on Mick Jagger's list came from a completely different world. A punk-inspired group that shocked audiences, but this time, they actually earned his respect. That band was The Clash. If there was one musician Mick Jagger clashed with more than almost anyone else, it was Elton John. For decades, their relationship was defined not by friendship, but by biting remarks and cold distance. While Elton rose to global fame with his flamboyant style, theatrical shows, and chart-topping ballads, Jagger couldn't resist mocking him, and Elton in return rarely missed a chance to fire back. One of the most famous insults came when Elton openly criticized Jagger's stage presence, saying he looked like a monkey with arthritis whenever he performed. It was a brutal comment, and Jagger never forgave him for it. For a man who had built his career on being one of the most magnetic performers in rock history, such a jab struck deep. Jagger didn't take it lightly, and from then on, he made no effort to hide his dislike for Elton. The rivalry wasn't just about words. Their personalities were complete opposites. Elton thrived on excess, costumes, and over-the-top productions, while Jagger valued grit, swagger, and the raw power of rock and roll. To Jagger, Elton's style was too flashy, too theatrical, and lacking the authenticity he believed real music needed. He saw Elton as a pop star playing dress-up, not a true rock musician. The two continued trading barbs for years. Elton mocked the Stones for being irrelevant in the late 1980s, while Jagger brushed him off with the same disdain he showed for Bon Jovi and Coldplay. Whenever Elton's name came up, Jagger was either sarcastic or dismissive, making it clear there was no admiration between them. Even in later years, when both men had mellowed with age, the tension never fully disappeared. Unlike other rivalries that softened over time, the frost between Jagger and Elton remained, built on years of insults and clashing styles. For Mick Jagger, Elton John wasn't just another pop act he disliked. He was a peer who openly mocked him, challenged his image, and represented everything Jagger didn't believe in musically. That put Elton firmly on the list of musicians Mick Jagger hated the most, not just for his sound, but for their personal war of words that lasted a lifetime. And there you have it, 6 musicians Mick Jagger never held back his dislike for. From Led Zeppelin's heavy riffs to Elton John's flamboyant style, Jagger made it clear who failed his test of real rock and roll. But now it's your turn. Which of these rivalries shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments, I'll be reading them. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story.